Sure thing. So, Web 3.0, right? Where did Web 1 and Web 2 even come? Why are we suddenly in Web 3 already? People just know the internet and suddenly there's Web 3. Actually, in short, right, a little bit of a disclaimer, there's no official definition for Web 3, right? So everybody can have your own personal interpretation. And in fact, part of the values is that as part of the community, as part of the users, we decide or we drive and curate what Web 3 is supposed to look like. If we decide to make it more like Web 2, Web 1, that can happen as well. But Web 3 comes with a certain set of values and a certain set of technologies that can enable these values. So I want to go into these, right? But firstly, I want to also engage all of you and say that it's a collective creation of this narrative, and the fact that you are here today and curious and open-minded about Web 3 and how you can engage in it is a very good start. Now, to share my personal understanding, Web 1, in the early stages of the internet itself, when people used to run their own servers, host their own websites, right? You create content, you have your own, instead of having a social media account, you have your personal website. Instead of hosting on Amazon, you run your own servers, right? You run your own forums and then ask your friends to come and talk to you on those forums. So it was a more kind of user-driven, more decentralized kind of version of the internet. But of course, the functionalities were more limited and a lot of convenience was not there, partly due to the technology, scalability, bandwidth, and so on, but partly because of how fragmented it was until we have stuff like Google that starts to index the internet. That's when we start to get to Web 2.0, right, where it was a much more upgraded version. And this was possible because of platforms. Platforms allow you to aggregate users, data, all the convenience, all the tools that you need in order to build those network effects. Allows you to have these rich experiences. So now I can search on Google. I can go on social media. I can rely on Amazon. I can rely on Shopify for my e-commerce needs. So all these has created tremendous value and created a whole internet economy that we are familiar with today. So why do we need Web 3.0? Right? What even is Web 3.0? I think some of us, including governments and institutions, have started to notice actually platforms are great, but we also see certain problems with it. Right? When you get really huge and you are in a position with your network effects in terms of data and competition, that you decide you can crowd out other competitors, you can decide to shut down people who integrate you, or even like buy out your copycats. And you control what the user sees and in fact try to influence their behavior. This is not to say it's evil or anything. It is just a natural business step, right? You're growing larger, you're trying to improve your revenues, right? You're trying to give value back to your shareholders. It is just simply the nature of it. And because the ownership of these platforms tend to be in a small group, tend to lie with sometimes public markets, but a significant amount of it is in the private shareholdings, the board, and so on. Your interests are not necessarily fully aligned with your users and your partners. So that's where Web 3.0 comes in. Web 3 envisions a version of the internet where the users, the partners, essentially you form Web 3, and whatever platforms you use, whatever communities you join, products and services that you engage in, why shouldn't you have more control? Why shouldn't you have more ownership? So with that as a starting point, what are some of the technologies that enable Web 3? For us, the answer is simple. It has to be some form of open permissionless blockchain. Why do we say that? And why specifically open permissionless blockchains? Like why even blockchains? I don't want to go into the whole like what are blockchains as a whole, but I want to talk about a few properties that are important. Right? I think one is that, firstly, is the idea of being self-sovereign. Hopefully it's not a too alien word. It just simply means that you decide or you control. You have the right to control what you have. It's kind of like, imagine you have an account and you have username and password, and therefore you control what you write in your account, right? Let's say on Facebook or Twitter, but not really. The platform can actually delete it anytime. Another platform that wants to read it may not be able to integrate it so easily. The platform itself might shut down in some cases or decide to censor some potential usage. in a self-sovereign world, using a form of cryptography like public key cryptography, essentially, as long as I own my keys, I can prove that I own it, and nobody else can change what or fake who I am. Right? Instead of relying on a third-party institution to prove who you are able to do it yourself. Now, when I try to prove it, what am I trying to prove, right? Maybe I'm trying to prove that, hey, on this e-commerce platform, I'm going to buy this item. Or on this social media platform, I'm going to post this piece of content. So what I'm doing then is maybe engaging in some form of data or assets. And again, those data or assets rely on these platforms, third-party intermediaries, right? To tell you whether, for example, that piece of data even exists. For example, any social media platform could delete, presumably, any content that goes on there. Any e-commerce platform could take down any of your listings, or even, in fact, they could just say that the transaction never happened, right? How do you actually prove? You need these third parties to actually show or rely on trusting them to tell you that these things happen, or these assets exist, or you perform a certain behavior. Now, in Web3, rather than relying on these guys to tell you this is what happened, this is what exists, these interactions, assets, data can exist on an open database accessible to everyone, and the interactions can be facilitated by smart contracts, another buzzword, which just means I can automate any of the interactions with code. So the implications for that is that rather than relying on centralized institutions, I almost have a bit of a public goods, like a public infrastructure. Imagine I go to this public marketplace where everybody can see us transacting, cash in exchange for goods, right? Rather than one person privately in a private room look at you, transfer, and then I verify, okay, it has happened, right? This one everybody can see, and everybody can verify that it's happened. So that's kind of an analogy for blockchains. And last point. So when you have these publicly verifiable, what we call immutable code, and which allows people to can't be evil, and enforces neutrality. You cannot stop people from transacting on there. You cannot stop people from taking away their assets or anything, generally speaking, or it's a lot harder if the records are on there. What does that mean then? Of course, there's some drawbacks, maybe sanctions will be harder to run because you can't just freeze people's assets, they own it, and they can use those services anytime. But it also means, for businesses, one of the most important things you look for when you operate is political stability, right? You want the platform to be there. You want your partner to be there. You want, in 5-10 years' time, if I'm building my business on Twitter API, I don't want them to just shut me down, right? If I'm plugging into a certain game engine, I don't want them to just stop supporting it. So when you have something that's immutable and public and decentralized, what you get now is that you can reliably build on top of it. Therefore, what this leads to is an unprecedented pace of innovation. You just build these building blocks, and everybody can start to take these Legos and build different businesses on top of that. And if I have my own data, somebody else can, for example, read what's in my wallet and provide a different service. I just sign with the same wallet. Right? If somebody has provided the transaction facilitation of e-commerce, and now I can build a different product or service, and I use this e-commerce platform transaction smart contract rather than building on my own. And when you do that, you get a very natural network effects that grow and are more open to competition, more open to new players, and are controlled and owned by users and partners who are creating value in this ecosystem.